Sanballat and Tobiah did everything within their power to stop the work of God's people. Tobiah mocked Nehemiah. If a fox were to climb that wall, it would crumble under his weight. Nehemiah was not deterred and turned to God for strength. This week, how to defeat discouragement and overcome opposition so you can finish the work God called you to do.
Well, we're studying the book of Nehemiah, and in case you missed previous weeks, let me bring you up to speed. Nehemiah was a Jew who was serving as the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes in Persia. Basically, he would taste the wine before the king would drink it to make sure it wasn't poisoned. One day, Nehemiah found out from his brother that the walls of Jerusalem, his homeland, were broken down and the gates were burned with fire. And Nehemiah was totally devastated. His heart was broken and he thought, somebody's got to do something about this. It might as well be me. So he prayed to God and asked the king for permission. Could I go back and rebuild the walls? And miraculously, the king sent him back. Well, Nehemiah traveled about 1,000 miles back to Jerusalem. He surveyed the damage, he assembled the troops, and after 140 years of hopelessness, Nehemiah brought hope. He said to the people, we can rebuild the walls. And sure enough, they started. And before long, they made progress. But the problem is, whenever you move forward for God, the opposition always shows up. And sure enough, the people of Jerusalem had opponents, Sanballat, Tobiah, and others, who were political opponents and said, we don't want the walls to go up. We've got to keep the Jews weak and broken and dependent on us. Honestly, they were trying to guard their power and their own financial interests. The bottom line is, whenever you move forward for God, your enemy wants to stop you. Well, today we're in the third week of the series called Change Your World in 52 Days. Next week I will finish this series, and to me, it's my favorite week next week. Now, for the record, that little wall that I was sitting on was much, much smaller than the wall that Nehemiah was building. Just the only wall we could find, so just want to say that for the record. Okay, Nehemiah 4 is where we'll be today, and I want to talk to you about how do you defeat discouragement when you often face opposition, because whenever you move forward for God, you need to understand that you have a spiritual enemy who wants to oppose you. In fact, the Bible says that our enemy, his mission is to steal, kill, and destroy everything that matters to the heart of God. There's one verse that says he roars around like a lion looking for someone to devour. Now, for the record, the lion comes from the cat family, and so there you see a tie-in between Satan and cats. Just want to make sure we're on the same page. But the truth is, whenever you do move forward and you're doing something that God calls you to do, your spiritual enemy will try to oppose you. And when we look at the story of Nehemiah, it's easy to think, well, hey, it should have been really smooth sailing. Because here Nehemiah, this cupbearer, living this comfortable life under King Artaxerxes in the palace at Persia, he sacrificed and went 1,000 miles to rebuild this wall. Surely God would remove all obstacles and there shouldn't be any opposition, right? No, actually, wrong. Here's the key thought if you're taking notes today. We need to understand that we don't face opposition because we're doing something wrong. We face opposition because we're doing something right. Could I get you all to help me out with that? We don't face opposition because we're doing something wrong. We face spiritual opposition because we're doing something right. Many of you may say, oh, that's such good news because I must be doing a lot right because I'm facing a lot of opposition right now. The truth is, if we're not doing anything significant, why should our spiritual enemy pay any attention to us? It's when we're doing something right that our enemy opposes. I'll give you an example from the ministry of the church. When we were starting out, we met in a little 2-car garage. We outgrew that and moved into a little elementary school, and we were so excited because they said we could stay and meet in that cafeteria for 2 years, and it was a big answer to prayer because we could save up money and then build a building one day, and we were finally getting a little bit of traction. We had grown to maybe 135 people, maybe 140 on a good week, and I thought, finally, we're seeing some people come to Christ. We're moving forward. This is great. When all of a sudden the school board decided they weren't sure if they wanted a church to be meeting in the school. And one Sunday morning, out of the blue, when I got there early to set up all the equipment with the volunteers, the janitor came to me and said, the school has decided that this is your last Sunday to meet here. I was like, no. You mean like a month from now? And he said, no, this is the last Sunday. It's over. This is your last one. And I felt like I got kicked in the stomach, couldn't even breathe, and had to stand up before our church and say, I don't know where we're going to be next week. We might be in a home. We might be in a park. Stay by your phones, because this was before email. Believe it or not, we actually did function that way at one time. And we'll call you and tell you where we're going to be. And I know with all my heart, we didn't face opposition because we were doing something wrong. We faced opposition because we were doing something right. Today, through the story of Nehemiah, I want to show you 2 different ways that our spiritual enemy tries to discourage us, and then we'll let his story inspire us through discouragement. The first thing, if you're taking notes, is this. Your enemy will attempt to discourage you from the outside. Your spiritual enemy will use external forces to try to discourage you and to cause you to quit. In fact, you can see this very clearly in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1 through 3. Nehemiah was building the wall, and the enemies showed up to discourage God's people. And here's what the Bible says. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and greatly incensed. So what did he do? Everybody say it aloud. He did what? He ridiculed the Jews. He made fun of them. And in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said this, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring these stones back to life from the heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Now, let me pause for a moment and let you appreciate my voice that I just used, because that was my redneck Jewish person voice. And my wife, Amy, said, anytime you make a voice, it's always like a redneck. And so I don't know why. That's just where I come from. And so anyway, they're ridiculing. You can't do it. This is stupid. And then verse 3, another guy named Tobiah chimes in, and I love this. Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they building, you idiots? Even if a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their walls of stone. Even if a little fox got up there, he'd break down the walls of stone. There's opposition from the outside. And let me show you 2 specific ways your enemy will oppose you from the outside. The first, if you're taking notes, is you'll often face obstacles. You're moving forward, you're making progress, and then you have to move out of the cafeteria and you're not allowed to meet there anymore. You take 2 steps forward and suddenly there's some type of opposition and you feel like you're taking 3 steps back. It could be God has spoken to you and you've decided we're going to get out of debt. We're no longer going to be in bondage. So you sit your family down. Baby, we're getting out of debt. We're getting a tattoo of Dave Ramsey on our arms. We're envelope cash. And then the very next day, your car breaks down and it's an $872 repair. 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. You may say, finally, I'm going to lead my family spiritually. And so you sit down and we're going to be praying and we're going to Bible study and we're going to be in a life group. And then your teenager says, I'm not sure I believe in God. 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. I talked to one lady, she owns a business, and she said, I decided I'm going to impart spiritual values, Christian principles into my company. And she said a year later, about half the employees quit. 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Is when you're doing something for God, expect obstacles, because our enemy doesn't attack you when you're doing something wrong. He attacks when you're doing something right. Give you an example. Years ago, I was teaching 7 times on the weekend. My body was breaking down, and I had a hunch that using video teaching would be an effective tool to do evangelism and build the church. I felt like God was showing us this, and so I told a few people, and everybody criticized, that'll never work, that's stupid. Well, my wife Amy gave birth to Sam between a Saturday service and a Sunday morning, because back then, about every other month, Amy gave birth to a kid. It's just like, we look at each other and poop, she's pregnant, and then there's a kid and another kid and another kid and another kid. And that's kind of what we did. And so I couldn't preach the next day, so I said, let's run video. And we ran the video, and it worked okay. So I said, let's start a video service at another place, something that had never been done before in the history of the world, to my knowledge. It was called Avoda. How many of you have heard of Avoda? You've heard of Avoda. Okay, how many of you have not heard of Avoda? You've not heard of Avoda. Okay, you know why? Because Avoda failed. Gone. Disappeared. A few weeks in, people stopped showing up. And we faced an obstacle in the middle of what we felt like God had said. Do you know how easy it would have been to say, well, God must not be in on this. It's not going to work, because I am convinced that so many God-given dreams die at the very first obstacle. Imagine if we hadn't pressed through and tried again. As of today, video messages will be played in over 200 other network churches. It'll be played at 15 live church campuses. There will be hundreds of churches over the years that pick this message up, play it later on video. Some of you right now are going, oh, I'm in a video church. I didn't know. And you may not like it, but if you come to see me live, you'll like it even less, because whenever someone comes to see me live, they always say, wow, we like you better on video. Number 2, they always say you're much smaller in person, which is not nice, okay? Feel this, baby, that's not small. But anyway, just saying. It's just, that's what always happens. And it was an obstacle that could have talked us out of what God wanted to do. Some of you right now, you've taken a few steps forward and you're facing an obstacle. Don't let an obstacle discourage you from doing what you believe God called you to do. The second way you'll face opposition from the outside is with criticism. Write that down, with criticism. In fact, that's the way Sanballat and Tobiah came after the Jewish people. Who are you feeble, weak Jews? You're never going to get anything done. If a little fox walked across your wall, the wall would fall down. And they criticized. And you'll get this too. You may get so excited about doing something significant on behalf of God. Many of you've said God is leading you to become a foster parent. And so you're like excited and you go and tell your in-laws, hey, we're going to go do classes on fostering. And then your mother-in-law looks at you and says, uh-huh, and you can't even take care of the 2 kids you've got. Criticism. And all of a sudden you feel deflated. Or, you're going to leave this higher paying job because God is leading you to a lower paying job, something that's going to use your gifts and make a big difference, and you can just sense it. And everybody's like, what are you smoking? That's stupid to take a lower paying job. I know so many students that you guys are pumped up, you're fired up, you're being bold for Christ. Some of you are going to start Bible studies, or you're going to be a witness, or you're going to have prayer meetings, and guess what your friends are going to say? You Jesus weirdo, you religious freakazoid, because as soon as you start doing something right, your spiritual enemy shows up to try to derail you. And here's what you need to understand. If you want to change the world, if you want to do something significant, if you want to be a leader, criticism is a part of leadership. Enduring criticism is a part of leadership. You just have to know that. If you're going to do anything significant, you're going to be criticized. And they criticized Nehemiah. And here's what Nehemiah didn't do. Nehemiah didn't call his people and go, they're being so mean. You guys, you know my heart, don't you? We're doing a good thing. If only they knew us and we could sit down with them, I could convert them. Okay? He didn't do that. Here's what he did. You read the text, he did 2 things. The first thing he did is when they criticized him, he took it to God. over and over and over again, he took it to God. And then the second thing he did is he got back to work. Anytime people criticize you, you don't have to lead defensively and beg people to be on your side. You take it to God and you get back to work. I'm always amazed at when I'm talking to friends and they say, Craig, do people ever criticize you? I'm like, does the sun ever rise? I mean, every day. I'm telling you, every single day, no matter where I am, people criticize, make fun of, belittle, on and on and on again. But the reason you may not know that is because I'm not leading defensively. Do you like me? I mean, there was a blogger who said something bad. Can you get on there and tell him the truth? I mean, there was some guy, Twitter, that has 12 followers who's saying bad things about me, and I'm so upset about that. Okay? Does it ever bother me to be criticized or misunderstood? I'm a human being, and the answer is yes, it does. But I never let that direct me into sloppy leadership. What I do is I take it to God, and I get back to work. Why? You have got to do that. I'm telling you. You want to make a significant difference. Take it to God and get back to work. Why? Because you don't answer to critics. You answer to God. I don't answer to it. There are some critics I don't want to convert. They don't want to be converted. Take it to God and get your butt back to work. And if you want to criticize me for saying but in church, you can email it to my email address, craig@idon'tgivearip.com. That is a real email address, and you will get a reply that says, I don't give a rip. Just saying. Okay, so when you're doing something right, your enemy will oppose you from the outside with obstacles or criticism. The second thing is your enemy won't just try to oppose you from the outside, but from the inside. Your enemy will try to discourage you from the inside. And here you can see this in verse 10, the insecurities of the Jewish people coming out. Verse 10 says, meanwhile, the people in Judah said, that this is Nehemiah's people, the strength of our laborers is giving out. And there's so much rubble that we what? Everybody say it loud. That we cannot rebuild the wall. What is this? This is discouragement from the inside. Listen, when you're doing something significant, I believe your spiritual enemy will try to discourage you from the outside and from the inside. We don't have what it takes. We can never, who are we to actually think that we could rebuild these walls? They've been down for 140 years. We don't have what it takes. We're not good enough. Whenever you're doing something for God, your enemy will try to discourage you from the inside. For example, years ago, before I preached my first sermon ever on a Sunday morning, I served with my hero, Pastor Nick Harris. I was an associate pastor under his leadership, and he let me teach at these smaller Bible studies on Tuesdays and Thursdays at lunch, but I'd never taught at the Super Bowl on Sunday morning. And so he gave me the chance. Well, the day before, Amy and I were at our house, and this big rainstorm came. We lived in a little 900 square foot house built in 1910, and it didn't have closets because in 1910, people didn't have clothes, I guess. They got one shirt and one pair of pants, and so we stored all of our stuff in the basement. Well, we didn't know that basements flood. And so there's this first rainstorm, and Amy looked down there, and the basement was flooded, and she's like, my wedding dress! Save my wedding dress! I was like, have no fear, Mega Man is here, step aside. And I ran down there, and I remembered that the previous owners left a sump pump down in the basement. And so I kind of went underwater, found the sump pump, found the cord to it, pulled it up, and thought, where do I plug this in? I'm standing waist deep in water. I looked up, and there was an extension cord. I thought, oh, that's where you plug it in. So I held one end of the cord along with the other in waist deep of water. But before you say, bless your heart, I just want you to know that I did pray, God, protect me as I risk my life. And I took the little prongs, and when I plugged it in, there was an electric shock that went through my body that I still think is vibrating somewhere on my backside. And I looked up, and Amy's eyes were big, and they were about to get bigger because this bad word formed at the back of my brain. And the force of the electric shock pushed the word through my brain and out my mouth. And it didn't just come out, but it kept coming out. And it echoed in the basement. And Amy looked on, and I could see the look in her eye. Oh, dear God, the last thing my husband is going to say is the mother of all words before he stands before God, and God says, you're condemned to hell for saying that in the basement. And she looked, and finally, obviously, I lived, and I walked back the walk of shame, carrying the wet wedding dress, and Amy just looked at me like, and I went up to my room, and I broke down crying, feeling like the biggest loser who ever lived. And the voice on the inside said, who do you think you are to preach? If your mouth would say that, you've disqualified yourself for talking about Jesus. Now, some of you are wondering, what word did you say? I'm not going to tell you because you may not come back. But in my mind, you wouldn't believe the discouragement, the defeat, the self-condemnation. And I can promise you, God speaks to you to do something great. You're gonna defend the unborn. You're gonna work to help feed hungry children. You're gonna minister to inner city teenagers. You're gonna take children into your home, and the voice is gonna say, who do you think you are? I mean, yeah, you sit down to cry, kneel down to pray, stand up to act. You got your little vision statement, your little plan. You're going to inspire people. I mean, and then you do all that, and guess what's going to happen? Nothing? Just like the last time. I mean, you're a student. What can a student do? I mean, you're a stay-at-home mom. I mean, what kind of difference can a stay-at-home? I mean, you're just a business guy. You're just trying to pay your own bills and barely doing that. Who do you think you are? And I can promise you, when you step out on faith to do something on behalf of God, you will face opposition, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something right. And when you do, you'll face obstacles, and you'll be criticized, and you'll be misunderstood, and from the inside, you may even doubt yourself. Why? Because your spiritual enemy wants to stop the work of God through God's people. And be encouraged. You're not being attacked for doing something wrong. You're being attacked because you are representing the God of heaven on this earth. You're being attacked because you are doing something right. I don't know about you, but every now and then I get discouraged. I get overwhelmed. I feel like I can't do it. I feel like the strength of the laborers is giving out, that we cannot rebuild the wall. How do you defeat discouragement? How do you defeat discouragement? Look at verse 14. Here's what Scripture says. Nehemiah says, after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Here's what Nehemiah said. Everybody say it with me. He said, don't be afraid of them. Speaking of the opponents, he said, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of them. If he were living in New Testament times, he'd say, hey, guys, listen to me. Gals, don't be afraid of them, because greater is he that is in us than he that's in the world. He would have said, don't be afraid of them, because if God is for us, who can be against us? He would have said, don't you be afraid of them, because who can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus? Can trouble, can hardship, can persecution, can famine, can nakedness, can peril, nor sword? No. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through Christ who gives us strength. I don't know how you're being so quiet today, because I know some of you, you're feeling it on the inside. I just wish somebody would stand up with me and say, don't be afraid of your spiritual enemy. Don't be afraid of them. Why not? Here's what he goes on to say. He says, remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes. He basically says, when you're discouraged, do these two things. if you are discouraged, if you feel overwhelmed, if you feel incapable or unworthy, you do these two things. The first thing, remember the Lord your God. Remember him. This is exactly what Nehemiah says. He says, don't be afraid of them, but remember the Lord who is what? Say it with me. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Remember our God who is great and awesome. When he would have said this to a group of Jewish people, what he would have said was a loaded statement. He's saying, remember when we were in bondage. Remember when your ancestors were slaves. And remember when God raised up one from within us, Moses. Remember when he encountered God in a burning bush that was not consumed. Remember when God called him and said, you deliver the people, and he didn't feel capable. And he said, I'm too nervous. And God said, who gave man his mouth? You go and I'll give you the words to say. And remember when our God raised up one of our own, and Moses stood down Pharaoh and said, no. Somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. Pharaoh, let him go. Let him go. Let my people go. And you remember when Pharaoh said no, and our God brought about 10 plagues that turned the heart of Pharaoh. And remember when